And you are live.
Welcome, everybody. It's Thursday, January 16th, 2025. This is the House Education Committee. We are going to begin today hearing from two of our own who were part of the legislative working group looking at what kind of legislation we could do to address our overwhelming school construction needs, and frankly, how we can use that as a tool to further whatever goals of the state we deem important moving forward. I think we'll just jump right in. The floor is yours, and just tell us a little bit about the committee and your work. We'll go in.
All right.
What do you like?
So a little bit of Representative Aaron Brady from Williston. I was a co-chair of the State Aid for School Construction Working Group in this past off session.
And Representative Chris Taylor from Milton, Georgia.
So a little bit of legislative history here. Last session, what became Act 149 created our working group to examine and make recommendations and propose legislation for a statewide school construction aid program. Our working group began meeting in July and we met through December, and it was a bit unusual, I think, in that our deliverable was not another report, it was a draft bill. It was possibly the smartest thing we did as a House Ed committee last year, because of a very tangible outcome of a working group that helps move our process along. Our working group, though, was the second iteration of a working group that existed the prior year in this long ramp of trying to get school construction reinstated. So we relied heavily on the School Construction Task Force report from Act 78 of 2023. And we really, in this session, in this working group, were quite narrow, and it was really just legislators. It was us, as well as Representative Emmons, chair of House Corrections and Institutions, and then 3 senators. It was us, Joint Fiscal Office, and Legislative Council, who we'll hear from shortly. And it was a fairly in the building kind of endeavor. And it's one of we'll talk in a minute about sort of the work we're going to need to do as a committee of jurisdiction, but it leaves some work for us to do as a committee of jurisdiction. So a few kind of grounding details about school construction that are probably not a surprise to anyone. We have had a suspension on any construction aid since 2008, I believe, if I have the year right. And 2 sessions ago, we've known that was a liability for a long time. I'm trying to remember who said it. I think they say it really well, but our school construction backlog is a financial liability for the state that requires a policy solution. And we've been trying to work towards that. Of course, it's a very expensive problem. And so everything we're going to say today is theoretical until we have the money, until we make the commitment, until it's a priority in our state budget, until the administration is willing to support. It's all theoretical. But we took some time as a legislative body 4 years ago to really understand the scope of the problem, which has helped lead us to this. And so we have one of the good things we have in our fairly bleak school construction scene here in Vermont is that we have a really clear idea of what our needs are. So we underwent as a state a very detailed inventory of our buildings and have a facilities index, or an index now of what all the facilities needs are, and some sort of approximations of what their useful life left might be. I was going to try to pull a few key numbers from that, but I don't think I have them right at my fingertips. We can pull up some old reports because House Ed has been hearing about this consistently now for 4 years and looking at the numbers, and they are daunting. Our charge as a working group, again, was to come up with draft legislation. And we really had sort of 4 areas that we needed to wrestle with. The governance of a school construction program, how would it be administered? The financial details. This House Education Committee spent a lot of time in the last session, in the last 2 years, looking at a model from Rhode Island. We zeroed in on that because they had a lot of similarities to us. It's a fairly small state, though very different, obviously very dense, not so geographically sparse. But they had also had a long time moratorium on school construction aid and had a huge backlog. And under state leadership, and the governor and their commissioner of education reinstated a really ambitious school construction program and are on a very ambitious program. But they had a lot of things that helped us sort of think about the challenges we have here and ways that we might model it. So we used a lot of their financial our committee, I think, had come to be pretty interested in the way that they were financing and looking at school construction. So we've been building on a lot of that work. So we had the finance details to look at as a working group. We had one bucket we called the political/hard decisions, which is where you're going to spend the money, what makes a project eligible, what kind of incentives should exist, and how do you target the program? And that was the other thing about Rhode Island, I think, that was very appealing to us, is that they had a highly targeted program, really trying to drive some of their education policy changes in the state. And then the technical details, quite a bit of how would the assurances and certifications happen? What kind of planning guides would be needed? What would the sort of process be for schools and districts and the agency of education? With a few fairly large miscellaneous items, one of which we're going to start to get into next week, which is that environmental hazards, and particularly PCBs, have dictated a lot of attention and energy and money in the facilities sphere. It's really the only big state money we've spent on facilities in the last couple of years, and not in any kind of sort of coherent policy reason for how what we're doing with schools where. So that was also under the technical details, but it's a pretty large technical detail. What am I missing about the sort of context?
No, I think really another important aspect of this whole thing is how big the charge was actually for this group to look at, and in the short amount of time that we actually had to do it. So it was a challenge to really dive into each one of these. And I think what we came up with was a pretty good framework of where we probably should go. But there are still a lot of decision points to be made. And that's where, and they're the biggest, really, a lot of the big decision points. So it's gonna take a lot of consideration moving forward and how this actually is finalized.
So we have a draft bill that will be introduced, that was the product of our work. And I don't, because it's not introduced yet, I'm not sure if it's up on the, it is up there. And it, in many ways, I think one of the surprising things we found was that a lot of the language and or sort of technical legal side of the program existed on the books in the old program. It just hasn't been used in that way in a very long time. So oftentimes I think the things that we were asking for, then Ledge Council would come back and say, well, that's kind of what's already there on the book. So a lot of it may be really a matter of reinstating and updating existing statute around school construction. I don't know if we want to necessarily walk through the whole bill or take questions. There's we have a draft bill. It lays out the governance of the program. It lays out the potential for finance and for a special fund, but it does not find the money. That's a much bigger political challenge here. In terms of the eligibility and incentives and sort of what would get funded and how, it starts it, but I think where we really ended up was that without knowing how much money, it's very hard to drive the incentives. And we're also, as we know from all the other testimony we've been getting, in this moment of potentially some pretty big systems transformation. And so how to make those align is something that's going to have to happen pretty quickly here. But we, as just our working group, weren't necessarily poised to be able to solve that. So there will be more hard decisions to be made about what are the priorities, what are the incentives that would make a project eligible. And many of the technical details actually, I think, are, aside from maybe PCBs and some of the environmental issues, we found we're in pretty good shape, that the AOE has really built some good capacity in that regard. And through their work with the district quality standards, the DQS, a lot of what we would have needed to sort of create is going to exist through the district quality standards. So what accompanies our draft bill is what we kept calling the letter, but sort of our working list of things we knew that were going to need more attention in the committees of jurisdiction. And that is posted, I think, with our testimony here today, and captures pretty well what are the big unanswered questions or things. The draft bill is not meant to be, I don't think any of us voted on it thinking this is perfect, ready to go, take it to the floor. This is a draft bill for now the committees to dig in much deeper. So the letter that accompanies it is sort of the list of the things that we're going to need to dig into and much of a testimony that we will need to get. And I want to acknowledge one of the things it's the last thing I think listed in the letter, but one of the challenges we found is that in the enabling legislation, the intention was to get to consult with a very, very long list of organizations and experts. And we did almost none of that. We were with 5 and plus 1 virtual meeting. That time alone for our group and Ledge Council and the expertise from JFO was quickly consumed. So we almost would have needed another whole cycle then to really do all of that consultation. And so, our hope was to get written feedback, but we were tight on time at the end. And so absolutely getting a very clear and strong response from the field and from a large group of organizations and perspectives that would be impacted is going to be important for us in this session if we move this forward.
I also think another challenge that we were facing with our group is that there's so many different moving parts going on in different kind of silos within the state house and within legislature and within just the school system itself. So very hard to come up with basically what I'm trying to say is that when we're going to look through this, there is definitely we're going to have to take into consideration all the other moving parts to really finalize how this product comes out.
Would you mind talking a little bit about what was our system? Or I guess it still is, but we don't have any money. And just, in broad strokes, how the proposal would differ from that.
The system, best I understand, and there was some interesting, this is where Representative Evans was incredibly useful, that there's a lot of institutional knowledge that existed in pockets that many of us, this long predate, when this sunsetted or when this was put on pause, predates most of the members on that committee, JFO, Ledge Council. So we were, we were relying a lot on that institutional knowledge and history. But if the program used to, I think a few things were pretty clear. It was run through AOE. It was basically you put in an application and the state aid was 30%. And then, there was much discussion of this, somewhere in the early 2000s, there was a big extra incentive for biomass and certain energy efficiency projects. And those quickly outran what the state could afford. That's sort of when the pause came about, because we extended, we had just.
It was very popular and used highly, and so.
Yeah.
I think it was a 90% incentive.
For that.
Right.
Yeah. There is also some interesting language though in the existing program about incentives around consolidation. Much of what we're wrestling with right now, everything old is new again. Some of these conversations have happened for a very long time. And institutional knowledge is helpful.
Yeah, I have a little bit of
Yeah, I
it.
bet you have some.
Having led many projects and having gone through this
Yeah,
program.
yeah,
If you were merging districts, you
Yeah.
could get 50%. And that was a intentional incentive, because even back then, we were looking at trying to support districts who were seeing a reduction in enrollment. So I think it was really important, and that is something that I wanted to ask about, whether that was on the table in your conversations around, because it's a much bigger deal right now.
So let me I'd like to just
Yeah.
stick a little bit more on the history
Okay.
before you
Yeah.
move on to that.
Yeah.
Interesting there was a 50% contribution if you were to merge 3 buildings into one, I think.
But the overall amount of the program now, I'm gonna struggle to pull numbers out, and if there's, experts in the audience that know them off the top of their head, I think at the most in any one year that we were spending was like 10 million? Does that sound rough?
Which
Like,
is
I think-
irrelevant today because
Right,
the
but
numbers
it-
are so different.
in the high years, it was about that, and it was through the capital bill, like the allocations were made through the capital bill. And so what this proposes, or sort of where we may be headed, is a different construct in that regard.
And I could just add one more thing that was
Yeah.
really important when you applied, you had to be approved. And
Yes.
certain aspects of your project may not be approved.
Right.
They had to meet very strict qualifications. So you would apply for a certain amount of aid, you rarely got everything you asked for. So I just want to make sure everybody understands it was a really strict program.
Yeah.
And that's a similar situation to what we were, trying to construct as well. where
Yeah.
It's not gonna be the full project that's gonna be, approved for, typically, I don't think it'll be the full project.
Right.
From a financial point of view, well, first of all, to the 50%, if you consolidated districts, just, I know it's interesting, I think only one district in the whole state took advantage of it.
Yeah.
But it was done through bonded dollars.
Yes.
It was not done through an annual allocation.
Right.
And so quickly, the state's bonding capacity got hit its ceiling. And so that's why the program had to stop. The new construct does not, it requires the school district to bond, but the state's contribution would be an annual contribution toward the school district's bond payment. So it wouldn't hit the state's bonding level. It would be non-taxpayer supported bonding or something. It was a term for it. And that's based on the Rhode Island model. That was what they came up with.
Some of the rules were around square footage
Yeah.
allowed, that kind of thing. So people understand what the regulations were.
Very technical.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very,
Yeah.
very.
And the EQS.
Yes.
is tied.
Yes,
tied
absolutely.
into this whole program as well, for sure. And there's also going to be prioritization, I guess I can call them bonuses, but there's also going to be bonus incentives as well.
Mhm.
Useful.
There was certainly a lot of discussion in the committee about priorities, bonuses, like that the state investment here needs to drive towards statewide education goals, which is where this sort of things happening at the same time in silos is challenging. The commission is set to determine a vision statement on the future of public education. The Agency of Education and Administration are currently embarking on. So there's a lot of simultaneous work happening that needs to come back together here, but we certainly talked about, that while we didn't identify the exact percentages or amounts of incentives and priorities, that the intent here is to drive towards those statewide goals and sort of transformation and consolidation that may be on the horizon here.
So would you like to kind of walk us through what you came up with and then kind of highlight the decision points?
Sure.
The policy decision points
Sure.
along the way, great.
I guess the technical language of what I just said is right under on the very first page, the statement of policy, the kind of intent of the bill, was our way to try to mark here really what we're trying to do, even if we don't have all of the legal constructs completely worked out.
Just to be clear, we're currently looking at the slide deck under Chris's name.
Oh, I was looking at the draft bill, sorry.
There it is. Thank you.
Or are we looking at it?
John Grace,
Was that?
Senator Johns.
Oh, okay. There it is.
Do we,
No proposal thing.
do we want to have John join us at this point or?
Sure, yeah.
Make it easier for.
Yeah. Chair.
Thank you. Your slide deck, you get center seat.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
Morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm happy to screen share if you would like, but I think if you want to just pull it up on your screen, then I can give you a really high level walkthrough of it. That might be simpler.
Yeah, we all have it open.
Yep. So the sets of things that this draft does, The existing program relies on different responsibilities being assigned to the State Board of Education and some responsibilities being assigned to the Agency of Education. This draft largely places the tasks with the Agency of Education. It will set up the program within the Agency of Education structure. They're going to hold the responsibility for this, and significantly, this would shift rulemaking authority from the State Board to the Agency of Education. So AOE is going to be where this is housed. This is standing up the program. So thinking about governance, that's where you're looking. So this sets up a model that is a debt service subsidy model, which is quite different from using the capital bill to do bond authorizations each year for particular projects. And as Rep. Conlon noted, one of the really important distinctions here is that that concept relied on general obligation bonding, meaning the state had to back those bonds so that a taxpayer could compel a levy to actually support those payments, and it run up against the state's debt capacity. And you guys get the CDAC recommendations that talk about how much the state can go out and do. So the structure that's proposed here is meant to to avoid those kinds of problems. So it sets up a debt service subsidy model where, as Rep. Conlon described, the municipalities would use the Vermont Bond Bank. They would leverage the bond bank to bond, and then the state itself would provide subsidies, but it wouldn't actually affect the bonding capacity of the state. The way that those subsidies would work, they would go through a process that's quite similar to what's currently on the books, which relies on a multi-step approval process. So there's a preliminary approval process, and then there's a final approval process. The final approval allows for a way to kind of check in and make sure that all the construction components are set up. The preliminary is like your funnel for checking particular projects to see if they meet conditions you would want to have in place. So if you, I'm just trying not to point you guys actually directly to the text, because I think it's easier to talk about it at a high level. Some of the things that are unique about this compared to the existing program is some new eligibility conditions that relate to encouraging master planning and ensuring a 5-year capital plan. So trying to get at a lot of the financial concerns that led to the moratorium that was imposed on the older program. On the financial side, the draft contemplates setting up a special fund. So this is where the dollars would go, and those dollars would be available to aid to construction projects. So kind of your classic thing that you're thinking about under the program, but it would also be available as contemplated for master planning grants, which would be necessary if you think of that as one of the new eligibility conditions. You wouldn't want to introduce a new eligibility condition and then not have funds to allow people to actually engage in that master planning. You'd also have funds available for emergencies, which is something that I think Brady and Taylor will talk about, that hasn't been worked through too much, how emergencies would be handled, but the idea is that funds would be available to emergencies. And the special fund would also cover the administrative costs of the program. And I think, again, this is something that they will come to. So 2-step process, debt service subsidy, and then sort of crucial to this is how you actually determining the kinds of projects that this program is meant to incentivize. Like, this is a great opportunity for you guys to take a stance on the direction you would like to see school construction and education generally go. So the two key ways that this program uses policy levers to achieve aid to school construction is through prioritization points, which you can think of as just, let's imagine a bunch of districts submit their projects. There's not going to be funds available to everyone. The prioritization points are ways of ranking different projects that come in and saying, here's where we want dollars to go. They're obviously not going to be available to everyone in a given year. So prioritization doesn't affect the amount of funds that would be available to a program. It's just ranking those projects so that you can say when, I think of it as a when question. When can a project get dollars? That's what prioritization helps with. A potentially even stronger policy lever is the bonus incentives that are built into this. So the current structure that's in the draft assumes and I think this is just a starting point for conversation, a base share of 20%. So that would be available to anything that is receiving, any project in a given year that's receiving funding. You get 20% of your debt service subsidy costs. So that would be all of your principal and interest payments across the lifetime of the project. So just to clarify, that would be greater than the total cost of a project because you're going to have interest that comes over time. So it would be lifetime costs of that project as funded for it. The 20% base share, and then you could get bonus incentives that provide additional state aids up to an additional 20% for those school construction projects. So bonus incentives are a really powerful way of pushing projects toward particular policy goals. And what I would say is currently in the draft, and this is fine if this is the approach that the group would like to take, is both prioritization points and bonus incentives are currently being built out by rule by the Agency of Education. You don't have to do it that way. You could take another approach where you actually spell out particular prioritization points and bonus incentives that you would want to have. But the idea implicit in the draft is that the agency would be building out in rulemaking those key levers to move particular projects down the pipeline. The other big thing that this draft does is sets up an advisory board. That advisory board, as I understand it, is meant to provide some level of transparency. You can imagine a lot of this rulemaking and the like happening behind agency doors, which makes sense. You have expertise to handle these things. But the advisory board would be a place where you have some kind of public accountability for the measures being taken here, and they would regularly have input on the set of duties that the Agency of Education has. There's some other pieces in here that I don't think are worth getting bogged down in, but that's the general concept. And I'm happy to turn it back over to these guys, or if you have questions about anything that I've said, I'm happy to answer those too.
Thank you.
I think this will lead really well into the letter and maybe some of the sticking points that we had as a committee, because we did talk a lot about the role of the advisory committee, if it was going to be an advisory committee. We also talked a lot about the weight of the bonus incentives compared to the base amount that a school could have. So.
Yeah, and we really arrived at those numbers knowing they need thorough discussion. And again, it all depends on how much money, like what is the investment here going to be from the state towards construction and facilities.
And that'll totally be a
Yeah.
policy
Yeah.
decision as we move forward for all of us to consider.
Yeah.
The 20%. It's all a policy decision, actually.
Yeah.
Do you want to walk through the letter a little bit?
Sure, this is, you can stay, you might actually be able to better answer some of the questions. The letter, you know, because our deliverable was different, often working groups produce a report. Of course, we wanted to say more than we could get in a draft bill, so this is our sort of like informal quasi report. But our way of making note of the things that really didn't get resolved or where we left off in the discussion, so that hopefully we can pick right back up in the committees of jurisdiction and be as expeditious as possible. So the unresolved questions and issues, undoubtedly, a big one is going to be timelines here. Whenever, if this comes online, what does that mean for projects that may be approved just before, maybe in the middle? How are we going to, how are we going to deal with the reality of potentially misaligned timelines? And the facilities work is continuing to go on. There are many districts doing small things out of necessity. There are some larger projects around the state that have been approved. So what will that mean in terms of those projects?
Just to add on to that, we also have a lot of districts who are not doing anything. because
Right,
they're waiting
waiting.
for us to make a decision.
Well, that's one of the questions I was gonna ask, was if this is likely to move forward, would schools want to know how close we are? I mean, I don't know how close we are, but to be like, if you were about to start something, maybe wait.
It's
They
already
would
happening.
desperately like to know.
Yeah.
Yes. There was much discussion about this terminology, 21st century standards for school facilities, but it was a little bit, it was just not something we could take a deep dive on. And so it would be helpful to get more testimony around that. I think the AOE is building some expertise on it, but what are some of the kind of common standards for construction and facilities work in these days? John mentioned this, but I think this is gonna be a really sticky issue, which is emergency facilities funding, because we have such a huge backlog. And we have so many buildings and aging buildings. This is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And the agency was really clear that the way it's written currently, the eligibility is very restrictive in terms of how the emergency facilities funding can be used. And we may need to reconsider. I mean, we have times when it might mean buildings aren't open or parts of buildings can't open for periods of time. What is some of the language I believe that exists is about it, it cannot be caused by deferred maintenance. Fully, how you assess what is due to deferred maintenance at this point is getting very challenging. And again, if it means a building can't open, we want kids in schools. So there's gonna be, I think, a real sticky issue and slippery slope about the amount of funding that could easily get consumed there.
We do currently have a program.
We do.
It's tiny, 50,000, 40,000,
Oh, my.
Nothing.
$50,000 for the whole state.
And really,
So-
there's the question of really, do we want to differentiate between the deferred maintenance and the emergency? Because deferred maintenance, it becomes an
Almost
emergency.
becoming an emergency in many
Correct.
places.
And the
Yeah.
roof fallen because of deferred maintenance or because of the heavy snow load, that the
Yeah.
deferred maintenance can no longer.
Yeah,
And I think the deferred maintenance bar in here may even be stronger than just the emergency conditions. And
Yeah.
the way that I was looking at this is you have to remove the deferred maintenance. You may want to come up with something else, but
Yeah.
you're gonna stop every project. You're having.
This is probably, the next piece is really probably more, for ways and means consideration, but we've been, excess spending threshold has changed a lot on, off, in place for some things, not for others in the last few years, and so how that applies to bond payments, is something that we're going, again, that may be more of a ways and means piece, but that we will need to consider.
Traditionally, when we've had an excess spending threshold in place, it has exempted capital construction costs. That was removed in the yield bill, I think, and the reason why is because there was creating a certain disincentive so that this work could happen. And construction projects weren't going ahead until we had a better handle on the statewide need, and what this program might look like. Now it's taking too long, I think, for some people, and then they're starting to get really worried. We can't pass a bond if we can keep this in the excess spending threshold category.
And if I could just add that, districts who merged under Act 46, and if there's any further mergers, it's a bigger deal for them because you might have merged with a district that has a great big fund that they're still paying on. Which would disincentivize our merging.
Yep.
So that does happen.
Yep. A little bit of a case in my own district.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily named explicitly in the bill. I'm on the next page, the budget request from AOE and capacity for implementation. We're gonna turn it over to JFO in a minute because they did some really good work, I think, mostly just in educating us better about some of the finance mechanisms and how things really work here and considerations we need to have. But it's clear that the AOE will need budgetary support from us in the budget bill with the administration's support to ensure that there's resources and staff to do this work. And it's going to require some increased FTE and expertise. The office, there were, I think, one or two when it was sort of in its peak, and there was nobody. Now there is, I think we've seen a lot of Jill Briggs Campbell, her role shifting a little bit, but there is some capacity there, but there's certainly, if this were to really restart, would need to be more capacity, especially as John was talking about the kind of increased role the AOE would play in all aspects of this program. So that's not a particularly exciting one, but it's a real reality of making this work. And it isn't huge. The rough estimate is 3 FTEs, which is, I think, roughly about what the Rhode Island program looked like too. John just mentioned it, a real kind of question mark sticking point is if we're shifting a lot of authority here to the Agency of Education, where is the kind of check on that and where is the opportunity for public engagement? And originally, I think the House Education Committee really liked the way that Rhode Island had a kind of advisory council, I don't even remember what they call theirs, but sort of another body that was helping to oversee the program. This took some different kind of iterations in our work as a group, and I'd say we really left with more questions than answers. Because if the advisory council is really just advisory, then do you need them? Is it really gonna have any teeth? Is it, if we're talking about people who, this is just one, who have other jobs, they're serving ex officio, is it really gonna have much authority or usefulness? On the flip side, if we're talking about a lot of money in a big program, and do we want to have all authority residing in the agency? We had the state board come in briefly on it, and they were pretty clear that they lacked capacity right now in terms of what they have on their plate, and supported the concept without getting into the details of some kind of other advisory council body that somehow has some role in thinking about the bonus incentives, where are we really trying to drive our policy, and looking at the program on a regular basis.
Yeah, this was definitely a topic of a lot of discussion. It originally started off with wasn't so much an advisory board. They actually were
Yes.
the gatekeepers to
Yeah.
rulemaking. The AOE would come up with a rule, and then the committee would have to say yes or no to the rule. So they had a lot more power at that point, or a lot more say in what goes on. And then when we started talking about the advisory committee, again, the need and the longevity of an advisory committee, does it need to go on in perpetuity, or does it need to just be there for the standing up of the program and then sunset out?
There was reference even to a concept, is it somewhat like the Green Mountain Care Board? But that's a professional, that's a very different concept. And so that big questions there that I think, again, it has to do with where are we going in all of this? What's the role of the commission in the next 2 years? What's the role of the agency going to be? How is potentially governance around the state going to change? So definitely need to continue to understand that. I'm not going to go more into, the concepts of priorities and bonus incentives are there. The devil's in the details, and that's, for us to work out or be clear about who we're giving the authority to make those decisions.
I don't know where you'd like to take the conversation next, if we need to hear from JFO.
I would love to, they really did some great work in helping us also just sort of level setting. I think this is helpful, not just for school construction, but understanding other aspects of the state budget and competing pressures. I think that was really helpful. So we didn't get to finding the money.
Yes.
Just, huge step forward.
That was my only question.
A vital point in this whole, thank you.
Thank you.
Chris?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Chris Roop. I'm the Associate Fiscal Officer in JFO. I very rarely show my face in this committee. I know very little about education, despite the fact that I spent a lot of time in school. But I primarily staff the money committees and also work with the appropriators. So I have a lot of insights into the budget process. So I'm going to be extremely brief in going through these slides. I'm happy to share my screen if you'd like, but I get the sense you'd like to follow along. Great. So I'm going to skip around and just hit the high notes because I know you're a little crunched for time and I want to leave some time for questions. But slide 3 sort of gives you the overview of the issue where, we're talking about state aid for school construction due to Vermont's unique funding formula for education. Everything we're talking about is state dollars. So that's something important to keep in mind when you're looking at how other states do things, sharing between like a local cost and a state cost. Here, it's all state dollars. What we're really talking about is coming up with a program that shifts some of the cost of school construction off of the property tax, quite frankly, and onto some other funding source. So that, which was already mentioned, and very elegantly, in the past, this program was funded through the capital bill, using, general obligation debt. There's just no capacity in the capital bill to restart the existing program, the way it was funded, 15 plus years ago. CDAC actually lowered its recommendation for how much, geo debt the state should incur from $54 million a year to $50 million a year. So that's just going to further constrain the capital bill. The need is colossal. $300 million of sustained annual investment a year for 20 years to replace Lakewood Lake. The working group has received testimony that that's likely a lowball estimate. Unfortunately, there's just no easy way to find $300 million with existing revenues. If you don't believe me, the very end of the slide deck shows some excerpts from the current consensus revenue forecast to give you a sense of how much money comes in and from where. And, we're talking about $300 million a year. For context, our entire sales tax, which is dedicated 100% to the ed fund, brings in about $600 million a year. So slides 4 and 5, I just want these give you just a high level overview. If you don't live in the weeds of finance, every dollar can look the same. And it's important to remember that money is different and there's a difference between funding and financing. So we talk a lot about bonds. Bonds are financing. Bonds are not new money. It's not manna from heaven. It's not, a windfall. Bonds really are advancing the future cash flow to make them available to spend today. It's important to remember that that comes at a cost in the form of interest over time, but it also brings benefits because construction is one of those things that it's typically cheaper to deal with it in the near term rather than defer it because construction costs always go up and facilities are always deteriorating. There's also advantages to financing. You spread the cost of a long-lived asset over the lifespan of that asset. So the future generations that are going to benefit from that building are also incurring some of that cost. But what's really important to remember is that you need to pay back financing somehow. So you need some money and the funding to enter that equation. And that's where, under our current law, should a school go out to borrow money through the bond bank to do a project, funding to pay for that bond automatically enters that equation through property taxes in the ed fund. It's kind of unique how we do things. I think the aid program that's being contemplated here would reduce some of that burden on property taxes by bringing state, sort of, we call them PAYGO dollars, non-bonded dollars into the house. I'm skipping through here to the slide 6 just highlights some other issues that were sort of discussed at the working group about revolving loans and public-private partnerships. A revolving loan is another tool that could be used, but there's a lot of questions about where would the money come from to capitalize it. Is there an unmet credit need? The real benefit for a revolving loan is, the savings on a lower interest rate, but the greater the spread you create, the slower that money revolves over time and the less likely it is to keep up with inflationary pressures. P3s are a new concept in this space. Prince George's County, Maryland just entered into one a few years ago where you basically enter into with a private partner. They agree to deliver a suite of buildings, faster, less expensive than a conventional project delivery process, but they need to earn a return somehow. So then in that example, Prince George's County is paying it's almost like a big rent payment to an outside outfit who built and maintained the schools for a period of time. The working group took some testimony on this concept, but it's just too soon to know whether that model would make sense for Vermont at scale, but it's an emerging concept out there and the working group was interested in looking at it.
I think one of the challenges with that, in addition to just the unknowns, is that, we aren't necessarily talking about tons of new buildings. There might be some or a few, potentially if we're talking regional high schools, but a lot of this may be retrofitting, expansion. We have a huge amount of stock in terms of that what exists in school buildings. And so, likely there would be some, but if we look at even the projects over the last few years, the biggest ones Burlington is new, but, you know, Winooski, it was a huge project that Colchester's looking at, you know, so it's, we're not, that's harder for a P3 when you're not, it's not a cookie cutter thing where you're building 10 new schools that look the same. You're retrofitting, hopefully, and using existing resources when that makes sense.
Would it be for, could it be like for existing buildings where there's a property management company that puts the bill that the town or the state pays?
Just because we're in a time right now, we have us not good document the details of the increase. So until we're really talking about this stuff.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, at a high level, whenever somebody wants to pursue this, they typically hire some third-party consultant to do some feasibility analysis and things like that. So, to your point, it's way too early to sort of know the details and whether it would be viable. I'm going to skip ahead to slide 8. One of the things I just wanted to highlight here is, as Co-Chair Brady mentioned in her testimony, you know, the working group did not come up with a recommendation on a funding source for the program. Quite frankly, it's a really big conversation in the building to have. It could take a lot of time that the working group did not have. And if you don't figure out sort of the mechanics and the structure of what it is you want to fund, it's really hard to have a conversation about finding money to fund it. So I think the working group very wisely focused their limited time on sort of figuring out what it is they want to do and how the program should function. Because until you get that squared away, it's really hard to have a conversation about resources. Something I really wanted to remind everybody, because I know there's new members of the legislature here, about the budget process. You know, one of the most important jobs you all have is setting priorities with limited resources. And the budget process is the primary way that you all do that every year. And it's just really important to keep in mind that the integrity of the appropriations process is really integral to you as a legislature's ability as an institution to engage in that priority setting process. And on slide 9, sort of a dovetails into that. Right now, the draft contemplates the creation of a special fund that the legislature would then have a conversation with the administration about how do you get money into that special fund. And the way you would do that is through the budget process, through interfund transfers. And I know that I'm going to go to slide 9, and this is something that I frequently talk about around the building. It's not unique to this issue, but everybody, whenever they're looking at a priority, they talk about dedicated revenues. I caution legislators about using dedicated revenues to solve everything, because there's a time and place for them, but not every priority is that time and place. And when you fund everything through a dedicated revenue source, you're essentially undermining the appropriations process and you as a legislature's ability to set and assess priorities. Dedicated revenues often don't keep up with the program needs that they are intended to fund. That can expose a program to fiscal risk when those dedicated revenues don't keep up with the needs. And sometimes it can create distance in that appropriations process. If there's dedicated revenue to solve this thing, it's easier for legislators to focus their limited time on other things. And it can sometimes be harder to have a conversation about the need to change the funding streams. They can be administratively burdensome from an accounting and tracking perspective. Most of our budgeting is done around the consensus revenue process, and that forecast captures the revenues that go into the 3 major funds. It doesn't capture dedicated revenues that go into every little pot. So being able to track that money coming into a big fund and then making a decision about how to spend all that money in that big fund is a good way for the legislature to maintain its prerogatives over setting budgetary priorities. So slide 10 just sort of gives you the overview of the thought process around that school construction special fund. Special funds are an accounting mechanism. It's sort of a bucket that you put money in. You can retain interest in that fund rather than it go to the general fund. And this is sort of, this leaves the door open to a conversation about where the money will come from to get into that fund. I think there's a there's a time and place for special funds. Not every issue is one. I think this one could be a good place for one though, because this is a situation where you would be appropriating revenues that, would be dribbled out over a period of many years. So I could see some advantage of sort of fencing off that money somewhere, collecting interest on it to help fund the administrative costs of the program. And that way schools have some assurance that, if we're making a 20-year commitment to be making, aid payments to them for their debt service payments, that there's some money sitting in that special fund to fund those payments. Slide 11 just gives you an example of where we see special funds elsewhere in the government and sort of the statutory definition of a special fund. And then my last slide that I really want to talk about, slide 13, just gives you some final considerations that you don't need to answer right now, but they're worth keeping in your head. That should this program move forward as designed, and you're creating a situation where a construction aid award would be paid out over 2 decades over the life of a bond, the legislature should consider how to fund those awards. And the example I put here is, let's say a school is going to get $20 million total worth of debt service subsidy paid out over 20 years. Does the legislature fund all $20 million up front? That way, the school knows the money is there and we can collect some interest on it, and we're not creating an ongoing funding liability for future legislators to figure out. Or do you budget on sort of a cash basis where instead of putting all $20 million in year one and then dribbling it out, you just budget, $1 million a year for the next 20 years. We often talk about tying the hands of future legislatures. This is sort of an area where fiscally we often tie the hands of future legislatures. There's trade-offs with all of this. And it's just something to keep in mind that the need is huge. I think there's going to be a real constraints on just how much money you can get out the gate. And you should also be mindful of the fact that, there's no free money out there. And regardless of how big the state aid share is to these payments, the piece of the payments that would have to fall to the local budgets would ultimately fall to property taxpayers and the ed fund under current law. So that's my quick spiel of this slide deck, and I'm happy to come back with if you want to go into a deeper dive or answer any questions.
Undoubtedly. I think because we have a changeover intent for new testimony, we'll just stop right there. I'll give the committee 10 minutes. Let's be back.